Hello, class. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 2, which covers Egypt and the Kingdom of Kush. And these are just some of the highlights of what we might, what we're going to cover. It's not everything, but the unification of Egypt is credited to King Menes. He united Upper and Lower Egypt and wears the double crown in around 3100 BCE. Don't worry about dates. I'm not going to quiz you on dates. After King Menes' reign came 31 dynasties over 3,000 years as he united Egypt. Okay. The era of the Old Kingdom, around 2690 BCE, is said to have began the age of the pyramids. The pharaohs were absolute rulers and viewed as a god holding absolute secular and religious power. Stone monuments were an embodiment of the pharaoh's power and a medium of immortality. Pyramids evolved from mastabas, then step pyramids, best known as the most known are the pyramids at Giza. Now, if you remember from the Jean-Paul Leon film, right? As he's studying the hieroglyphs, he wants to know more. He wants to know why death was so important to them. Why was it so important to the Egyptians? Well, the pyramids were like a resurrection machine. It was meant to launch the pharaoh into the afterlife. And we'll get into more detail about the Egyptian mythologies of the afterlife later. Imhotep is a very important figure. He was not a ruler, but was revered, and his life was recorded as that of an architect, a doctor, and the right hand to the pharaoh Zoser. In fact, he's responsible for the first pyramid, the Zoser pyramid. And I'll show you a picture of that also later in the presentation. The national god, Amun-Ra, began around the Middle Kingdom under the Theban kings of the south. The Theban god Amun merged with the sun god Ra, which became the Egyptian national god Amun-Ra. Okay, so they combined two gods and created another one. We'll get into how the gods and goddesses were worshipped as well. Okay. The natural barriers of desert and sea insulated Egypt from invading armies and migrating populations. Okay. So unlike, the Mesopotamians, okay, the Sumerians had to worry about invading armies, whether it be the Assyrians, the Akkadians. The Egyptians were, for the most part, safe from that type of situation, but they did have instances of foreign invasion. We'll get into that in a minute. Egyptian art and culture exhibited a degree of continuity unmatched by any other of the other early civilizations. Unlike the Euphrates River, the Mesopotamian civilization, the Nile was very easy to navigate, okay? And it gave access to the entire region. It was a natural aid to central government and was a great place for agriculture. It was very easy to farm and harvest the crops along the banks of the Nile. Before 3000 BCE, settlements were divided into two countries ruled by separate kings. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Not until King Menes is pharaoh, right, that he unites Egypt as one. Okay. Egypt had its first central government with a single capital 500 years before Samaria did. The pharaoh, okay, was the Egyptian ruler, and he was considered a divine protector of natural forces such as the Nile inundation, rain, and fertility. Because he was considered a divine ruler, his personal welfare was closely tied with his people, that his will deserved unquestioned obedience. Okay, so the pharaoh was considered semi-divine. He was godlike. you had this connection to the gods and goddesses. Unlike the Sumerians, okay, as we all know, though Sumerian kings were given utmost authority, they were never seen as gods. In fact, the only Sumerian king, right, that was considered godlike was Gilgamesh, right? We all remember the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the pharaohs were different. The pharaohs were considered partly divine. The Old Kingdom, okay, is said to be around 2686 to 2180 BCE. Don't worry about dates. I'm just kind of giving you a timeline. Little is known about the Egyptian civilization prior to the Third Dynasty, the first of the Old Kingdom dynasties. From this time forward, numerous records attest to the administration of this advanced society. Egyptian writing, like Mesopotamia, okay, had been used about 3100 BCE. Writing was essential to Egypt's complex administrative system. They used it to record historical events, business transactions, and scientific and literary purposes. So similar to that of the Sumerians. However, unlike the Sumerians who used cuneiform writing on clay tablets, the Egyptians used pictograph writing called hieroglyphics. Okay, it was cumbersome and difficult to master. They usually either wrote them on the walls within the pyramids or the palaces, or they would also write them on paper called papyrus. Okay, it's a type of material that were used, like scrolls, if you remember from the Jean Paul Leon film. Various papyrus scrolls held, written hieroglyphs that he was using to decipher, learn more about Egyptian culture, the ancient civilization, and of course was very difficult to master. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone, if you remember from the film, by a French scholar in 1822 enabled modern translators to unlock the meaning of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. The Rosetta Stone contained a decree in 3 languages, including Greek. And we'll get into the reason behind that later on when we're talking about the Ptolemaic period. Form of writing consistent with what we call the alphabet. Okay, that's where we get the term alphabet, alpha and beta, first letters of the Greek alphabet, developed out of the need to create a more efficient way for soldiers, traders, and merchants to learn and communicate. However, it is believed that the Syrians or Palestinians living in Egypt developed an alphabetic system of writing in about 1900 BCE. The alphabetic writing system was further developed by the Phoenicians and probably passed on to the Greeks as early as the 12th century BCE. Now, the term Phoenicians, okay, may sound familiar. If you are aware of the term phonics, I don't know if any of you, there used to be a subject course where people would learn phonics. It was it's like kind of the learning of sounds, vowels, the combination of certain vowels, how do they sound, how words sound. And some theorists say that that's where the practice of learning, sounds, vowels, putting words together, came from the Phoenicians. Okay? A system of practice. Egyptian religion. As you remember from chapter 1, polytheism is the belief in many gods. Monotheism is the belief in one God. Egyptian gods controlled the forces of nature. Egyptians did have a polytheistic religion. Egyptians identified the gods with animals such as cats, jackals, dogs, falcons, cows, hawks, etc. So they had kind of like a human body, but they had these animals' heads on. Egyptian religion combined hundreds of gods who would sometimes combine to form new gods. Egyptian theology grew ever larger through accretion. New gods and doctrines were added without discarding older contradicting tenets. Although gods were created by combining one god with another, such as the fusion of Amun-Ra, the same cast of gods was revered for 3,000 years. Okay, so even though Amun and Ra were combined to form a new god, The Egyptians did not discard Amun by himself or Ra by himself. They still kept them in the list of gods to be revered, obviously to avoid any sacrilege or blasphemy. They just wanted to make sure that they still paid homage to the original Amun and the original Ra. So the list kept growing longer and longer. When Alexander the Great and the Greeks conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, they adopted some of the Egyptian gods. Okay, so many of the gods that we know of the Greeks, such as Hermes, was associated with Thoth, a god of writing and wisdom. So this goes back to the theme of this semester that I want you all to remember, is that all these civilizations, okay, inspired the next one. Okay, there wasn't no original, oh, the Greeks were the first to develop these type of mythologies. Well, not really, because they adopted a lot from the Egyptians, and the Egyptians also revered the Mesopotamians. So each culture influences the next. Egyptian gods were considered benevolent. Unlike the Mesopotamians, though, Egyptians did not fear their gods. Okay, they revered them, they loved them. The oldest Egyptian gods were protectors of a particular city or province and continued to be worshipped throughout Egyptian history. One of the early gods, Ra, the sun god, his cult center was known as the Heliopolis. Okay, so the Heliopolitan myth of creation. Ra created himself out of his mother Nun through the primordial waters. Then he created Shu, the air god, Tefnut, the moisture goddess, Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. Just check it here. Sorry about that. I just want to make sure we were still recording here. So Jeb and Nut had offspring of their own. Okay, Seth was the evil brother of Osiris. He had a head of an unknown animal. Sometimes he was a crocodile, a hippopotamus, or a black pig. Nephthys was the protective goddess of the dead. She was the sister of Isis and Osiris, and the sister wife of Seth, the mother of Anubis. She is often shown on coffins or in funerary scenes. Osiris is the god of the Nile and the dead. He's often portrayed as a bearded green-faced man in mummy wrappings, and I'll get into his story in a minute. One of the primary reasons why his face is green is because he was supposed to represent the fertile riverbanks of the Nile. His wife, Isis, okay, Osiris's wife, had wings, horns, or hieroglyph on her head. Anubis, who is the guide of the dead and god of embalming, usually is portrayed as a dog or jackal head. He helped embalm Osiris after his death. I'll see if I can show you in a minute. Let me see if, yeah, let me show you what they look like. Okay, so here's Osiris. Okay, there he is wrapped up like a mummy. There's his green face and a long stem beard. Right. If you notice, he has two. He's carrying two things in his hand. One is this, like a shepherd's staff, and the other one is kind of like a whip. Okay, it's kind of to show he's the law and order as well as the protector of his people. There's Anubis. Okay, there's the jackal head. His Osiris's wife Isis. Horus, okay, is Osiris's son. He's the eye of Horus really is what's more recognizable about him. You'll see his symbol everywhere in images of within the Egyptian pyramids. There's Seth, Osiris's brother. Okay. And here in the top left corner is Amun by himself, and then at the top bottom, right corner is Ra. Okay. Eventually, these two are combined to form Amun Ra, but these are kind of what they look like by themselves, the original gods. Okay. So now going back to here. Among the most important gods in the Old Kingdom was Ra. The religious beliefs based on the solar theology of that god. Middle of the Old Kingdom. Okay. The belief that the pharaoh was a semi-divine. Primary title for the king or pharaoh from that time onward was son of Ra. In fact, that's what pharaoh means, son of Ra. Why? Because again, they wanted to make sure there was a connection to Ra. We have his representative here on earth, taking care of Egypt, and thus we are protected by Ra. In fact, because they worshiped the sun, right? That's why gold was very important to them, because the metal itself looked like to them like a physical image, okay, that represented the flesh of Ra. However, this was only one aspect of the divine associations of the king. Associated with Horus, the falcon god. In death, he was equated with Osiris, the father of Horus. In doing this, the royal succession was enforced by myth for each new king, whether or not he was actually related to his predecessor by birth, succeeded his father as the new Osiris. This created the myth of a single lineage of kings. Okay, so this is kind of like their way of doing like a loophole. So let's say you're the pharaoh, you don't have a son to take over, or your son dies at an early age. The next in line would probably be, another male relative, cousin, nephew, whatever it may be. But because he has the title of pharaoh, son of Ra, he is technically, in a way, still connected. The link did not break, according to the Egyptians. Now, the myth of Osiris and Horus is that basically, Osiris was chosen to be pharaoh. He was to rule Egypt. But his brother Seth was envious of his title. And so, he wanted to be pharaoh. So one day during a party, he tricks Osiris into getting to a trunk. He tells him, I bet you can't fit in here. And he challenges him or something, and he tries to get in, and he does. And Seth, takes the trunk with him. He kidnaps Osiris, and he chops up the box with him in it, basically killing Osiris and spreading his pieces all over Egypt where no one could find him. But his wife, his devoted wife Isis, goes on a quest to find every piece of Osiris's body. And she does, and she assembles him and puts him together. And she wraps him up like a mummy. Okay, she wraps him up, and then Anubis, embalms him, and thus, after saying several chants and rituals from the Book of the Dead, Osiris resurrects. Okay, and but when Osiris resurrects, he tells them that he found a pathway to the afterlife, and thus he is now the ruler of the dead. He will no longer live here on Earth. So, and that is what leads us to the whole concept of the Egyptian afterlife. Okay, the Egyptians believed in an afterlife for those judged worthy by the gods. Okay, so when the pharaoh dies, okay, they must follow the same rituals that Osiris did to resurrect. Okay, so that's why they do what they do. They once the pharaoh dies, they have to wrap him up the same way Osiris was wrapped up. They have to recite the same chants that was done when Osiris died. And the Egyptians believed that the pharaoh would resurrect into the afterlife. They're now in the pyramid. He'll eventually be launched into what they believed was the pathway to the heavens, right? They called the pathway the indestructibles, okay? But now astronomers call it the circumpolar stars. Okay? So when the pharaoh dies, okay, he goes to the underworld where he'll find Osiris. Okay? Now he doesn't automatically, wake up into the afterlife and there's Osiris. He has to go on a journey to find him, and that's one of the reasons why the Egyptians bury the pharaoh with all these objects. He has, weapons in case he encounters some vicious creatures. He has musical instruments in case he's bored, literature, benches, chairs in case he wants to sit down, swords, shields, chariots, food, wine, everything you can think of. They would put it in the pyramid because they believed that if the pharaoh would, resurrect, he's going on his journey, and all he had to do was think of something, and luckily it's in the tomb with him, with his body, it'll appear with him as well. That's what they kind of believe. But let's say he goes and he finally reaches Osiris. He doesn't automatically get accepted. He has to recite a long negative confession. And how that works is that he basically has to say, I did not do this, I did not do that. He has to say it that way. I did not cheat on my wife. I did not whip my servants unjustly. I did not mistreat my servants unjustly. I did not steal. I did not. Should he pass this test, the next test is that he had to weigh his heart against the feather of Mat, which is the symbol of truth. Mat was an abstract deity known as the goddess of truth. So it's kind of like a scale. And one scale is the pharaoh's heart, and the other scale is the feather. And if it's even, then his heart is pure. Now, when the pharaoh would die, okay, the Egyptians would remove all of his vital organs except for the heart. They would leave it in his chest because he was going to need it for his journey and for this test. So, again, if his heart is light, he is innocent. He goes on to the other world, to the happy field of flood. If his heart is heavy, he's guilty and he's fed to Amit, okay, who was the devourer of souls, a crocodile-shaped creature and eater of the dead. Okay. Now, a student in previous semesters had asked me, what if they admit, okay, during their negative confession in honesty about what they did, but they were sorry for it? Doesn't matter. They will be devoured by Amit. Okay, so there's a lot riding on the pharaoh during his life here on earth to be a good ruler, to rule justly, or else he's going to suffer in the afterlife. Okay? And not only is it riding on him, but his servants as well. Okay, because that's one of the primary reasons they're building this pyramid for him while he's, getting older and throughout his life, because they hope that by the time it's complete, by the time he dies, the pyramid is complete. Because once the pharaoh is admitted into the afterlife with Osiris, into paradise with Osiris, his servants, when they die, will eventually join him. So life and death was measured in accordance to Mat, the goddess and symbol of equilibrium of the universe. The king had to rule according to her principles. Death was viewed as a new beginning. Afterlife was common to all, regardless of social status. Preparation varied, as well as goods stored in tombs. two common principles: body preservation in a lifelike form, and the deceased must have items necessary for life in the afterworld. Like I mentioned before, all the things he needed: shields, vessels of wine, food, musical instruments, chariots, whatever he needs. Personal belongings were usually placed in the tomb to make the Ka, the pharaoh, more at home and to assist the dead in their journey into the afterlife. Text was read from the Book of the Dead, which was a collection of spells, charms, passwords, numbers, and magical formulas for the use of the deceased in the afterlife. So let's say he encounters some kind of magical force. This Book of the Dead will help him, protect him from any harm. This is kind of like an illustration of his test. So this figure in white here, that's the pharaoh. He's being led by Anubis with a jackal head. And his first test, and he probably passed his negative confession. Now he's going to the next test here, and that's the scale. He has to weigh his heart. That little red dot you see there to the left of the scale is his heart. And to the right here is the feather. And right here you'll see Amit, okay, with the crocodile head. He's kind of looking at like, do I eat him? Okay. But he passes the test. He passes both tests. And now you see here's Horus, okay, the son of Osiris, welcoming him to meet his father. And here's Osiris sitting on his throne. And back there is Isis and Mat. Okay, so they're both there welcoming the pharaoh. Egyptians look forward to their afterlife and plan well for life after death. Again, the pyramids were the burial tombs for the kings. They would be filled with food and riches to go with them into the afterlife. Egyptian people worked on the building of the pyramids 3 months a year during flood season. Now here, you'll see a lot of the images. I don't know if you see it in this one. You'll see that Anubis is carrying it, Horus is carrying it. It's the Ankh. Okay, the Ankh was the symbol for life. The Djoser Pyramid. Okay, the Egyptian pharaohs of the Old Kingdom had elaborate palaces, but only the pyramids made of stone survived. The Step Pyramid of Saqqara in 2650 BC was a tomb for the pharaoh Djoser. The Step Pyramid of Saqqara served as the prototype for the true pyramids that were built later. And I'll show you an image of the Djoser Pyramid in a minute. The most famous pyramids are the tombs of Cheops, Chephren, and Mycerinus, and are located a few miles north of Saqqara. The Chephren Pyramid complex includes the famous Sphinx. Imhotep, as I mentioned during the first slide, he's the architect of the Djoser Pyramid, and I'm going to show you a picture of what the Djoser Pyramid looks like. Show you. Okay. So this, let's see if I can get a better image of it here. There we go. This is the first pyramid, first concept. Okay, it obviously looks primitive compared to the other ones, but you know it was Imhotep's first attempt, and it was for the pharaoh Djoser. Okay. So what were the legal traditions? Law was governed by religious principle of Maat, even in this world. Goddess Maat represented truth, righteousness, and justice, balance, and order. Laws were applied equally to all classes, specifically the family, children, and wives. Punishments could be quite severe. and it acted as a deterrent or to disgrace the guilty. Some examples of punishments for minor crimes: 100 lashings. For more severe crimes, rapists were castrated. Corrupt officials had their hands amputated. Crimes that resulted in a death sentence could have choice. You could either choose to be devoured by a crocodile, commit suicide, or burning alive. Okay, so I guess out of those three, it's the less painful. I guess if they give you a choice. But those were the three punishments by death. Okay, so little is known about the cause of the breakup of the Old Kingdom, or what happened in the intervening decades prior to the emergence of the Middle Kingdom. Excuse me. Egypt reestablished itself with a central government and as the dominant regional power by the 11th dynasty rulers, Mentuhotep II and his son, Mentuhotep III. These pharaohs encouraged worship of the sun god of Thebes, Amun-Ra. The prosperous era was marked by expansion, with the Egyptians subjugating Nubia and the Sudan and expanding its own territory into Palestine. The decay of the Middle Kingdom is attributed to the infiltration of Egypt by the Hyksos of Palestine and advanced people who introduced new technologies to Egypt. Sometimes when you look at images of the Egyptians and the pharaoh on his chariot, shooting the bow, all of that really was because of the Hyksos. They were introduced by the Hyksos, such as the compound bow, the chariot, the style bronze dagger, and other agricultural techniques as well. The humiliation of proud Egypt being dominated by foreigners had a lasting impact on Egyptian culture. The Hyksos would be expelled by the 17th dynasty in Thebes in Upper Egypt. The expulsion of the Hyksos marked the beginning of the New Kingdom. Soon after, the pharaohs dedicated their energy to conquering Nubia and the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Egyptians garrisoned troops in these conquered areas, and under Thutmose III, the Egyptians crossed the Euphrates into Mesopotamia. Now, Thutmose III expanded Egypt and their boundaries to make it this great empire. Historians today refer to him as the Napoleon of Egypt because of that, just as Napoleon expanded the borders of France, creating the French Empire. Excuse me. Okay. Queen Hatshepsut. She was the daughter, sister, and wife of Pharaoh Thutmose II. She ruled first as regent on behalf of her young nephew, Thutmose III, who was heir to the throne, and then ruled in her own right, adopting the title of king instead of queen. So her nephew was really in charge, but because he was young, she just took over. Hatshepsut's rule was active and energetic in the tradition of the great pharaohs. The tradition of burying pharaohs in pyramids, however, was passed when Hatshepsut ruled. This was due to the fact that many people would, break in and desecrate the tomb, steal stuff. So eventually they decided to start burying the pharaohs in secret. It would be in the Valley of the Kings. If you remember from the Champollion film, he's traveling in Egypt and he wants to know, well, why is it called that, right? Why is the Valley of the Kings? So he finds out that there are all these pharaohs buried there. So, and Hatshepsut was one of them. The Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari is an impressive structure that commemorates Hatshepsut's life and rule. It was also a time of extraordinary achievement in art, architecture, and painting. So she was a very great pharaoh. Okay. Again, she wanted to be referred to as king, not queen, because she believed it had more authority. And she also wanted to be portrayed as a man. She wore a fake beard, kind of like the beard of Osiris. And in her images, she was always portrayed as a male. This statue of her is one of the very few that depict her as a woman. Okay, and the beard symbolized royal power, which she wore. The Amarna period was a time of prosperity and great cultural achievement. The Amarna letters are preserved correspondence between the king of Egypt and the kings of Egypt, Babylonia, and the Hittites. Egypt had become a multicultural and multiracial society. The sun god Aten became a central fixture in Egyptian religion during this time. Aten was unique because it was one of the few gods that was represented as a round sun disk rather than a man or an animal. It's just the symbol was a sun. Aten's elevation to the exclusion of other gods was imposed by King Amenophis IV during his reign. Now, Amenophis IV is usually known as his other name, and that's Akhenaten, which he eventually changes because his devotion to Aten was so extreme that he believed that he was Aten, and that's why he changed his name to Akhenaten. He initiates a new decree of monotheism, only one God, and that is that of Aten. Okay, no more other deities. So he orders the removal of all deities in Egypt. And again, like I mentioned before, he considers himself divine and as Aten himself reincarnated here on Earth. After Amenophis' death, or Akhenaten, King Tutankhamun, commonly known as King Tut, resumed Egypt's traditional polytheism. Now, King Tut, and we'll get into his story when you see the film on Howard Carter. King Tut was a young boy. I think he was 8 or 9 years old when he took over the throne. And many believe that he was being manipulated. Someone else was pulling the strings, and that's why they went back to polytheism. He didn't really order the decree. Other people were influencing him to do so because, they found Akhenaten to be a heretic. Okay, he was being very blasphemous, doing these things, getting rid of all the deities. They didn't want to upset the other gods. So once Akhenaten died and King Tut came into power, the high priests were trying to reinstitute the old ways of Egypt. Now here's Akhenaten, okay, praising Aten. Now this is just his crown. That's not his head. Okay, but I want you to notice like the way he's portrayed here. There are 2 theories as to why he looks like this. One is that because he thought he was God on earth, he wanted to be in like the way he's portrayed in his images. He wanted to be shown as a representative of both genders, okay, men and women. Another theory is that he had Marfan syndrome, okay, which is the elongation of the arms and legs, and that's why he looks like that. He's here with his wife, Nefertiti, okay, worshiping Aten. This is the golden coffin of Tutankhamun, or King Tut. King Tut died very young, at the age of 18. His reign was very minor. I mean, he wasn't really relevant to Egyptian history. Some argue, well, why is he so famous? Everybody talks about the curse of King Tut. Well, because the discovery. Okay, the discovery of his tomb was like big news. It was during the early 20th century. Howard Carter would discover it, and you'll see a great film on that, similar to the Jean Paul film. And it became big news because when they found his tomb, it was intact. It was one of the very few that hadn't been touched, it hadn't been robbed, it hadn't been discovered. So it was it was big news for everybody. And that's why his name kind of has lived on to this day. But the boy himself was not very relevant to Egyptian history. After Tutankhamun, Egypt sought to aggressively defend its expanded borders, which included Syria, Palestine, parts of Nubia, and much of the Arabian Desert. Invasions from the west and from Mediterranean islands put Egypt in a defensive posture, and the empire began losing control of its colonies. During most of the Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period, Egypt survived as a divided country, with a pharaoh in the north at Tanis and another in the south at Thebes. Order was restored for a time when the southern kingdom of Kush in Nubia invaded Egypt at the invitation of the southern Egyptians. The Nubian kings did not reside in Egypt, but ruled through their daughters, who ruled as virtual kings. And I'll go over the Nubians later in more detail throughout the lecture. The Kushites were forced out by the Assyrians, who had to abandon their conquest when their homeland came under siege by the Persians. Okay, so that fourth bullet point is kind of like what we were talking about in chapter 1. Okay, you remember when we were talking about the Assyrians covering Mesopotamia, they expanded as far as Egypt. Well, this is the outcome of it. These were the consequences. The Kushites were forced out by the Assyrians, who eventually are thrown out by the Persians. Okay? The Saidi period, which followed after the Assyrian occupation, was the last independent dynasty of Egypt. The Persians conquered Egypt in 525 BC, as did Alexander the Great a century later. Okay, so the Persians take Egypt, and then 100 years later, Alexander the Great throws them out. Alexander the Great was hailed as a savior of Egypt for allowing Egypt to revert to the cultural traditions that preceded the Persian conquest. And that was one of his, positive attributes. He was one who believed in preserving history. He was a student of Aristotle. So Alexander the Great made sure to take care of Egypt as best as he could. Unfortunately, he died very young, and the empire was divided among his generals, with Egypt going to Ptolemy I. So this brings about the Ptolemaic period, Egypt under Greek rule. If you remember from the Jean Paul Leon film, the Rosetta Stones, the Rosetta Stone that they found, that was one of the stone tablets that the Ptolemaic rulers erected as a way of kind of like extending an olive branch to the Egyptians, saying, look, we have these stone tablets, they're written in hieroglyphs, but they weren't really traditional hieroglyphs. You remember what Jean Paul Leon said? This is all Greek interpretation. I need to go to Egypt physically and go into the Egyptian tombs, into the pyramids, before the Greeks occupied Egypt to prove that my theory works. Okay. In the following century, the upper classes of Egypt became part of the Hellenized society that dominated the Mediterranean from Syria to Spain. A legendary beauty known as Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemaic rulers. Okay. It's often misunderstood that Cleopatra was Egyptian. She was not. She was Macedonian. In league with Mark Antony, Cleopatra expanded the power of Egypt for a short time, but was on the losing side of a civil war that briefly divided the Roman Empire. Part of that civil war is believed that many did not like Cleopatra. They didn't like the fact that she and Mark Antony were having a romantic relationship. And eventually it results in her being arrested, and I believe she does commit suicide while she's being held. Okay. These are just some images. I believe they're also in your book. Just want to go right here. This is the temple of Ramesses II. If you remember, it's also in the Jean Paul Leon film. They want to know who's in the cartouche. Okay, above here, and Jean Paul Leon's able to decipher it. through the use of Coptic, and he's able to identify the temple. We go jump to Nubia, okay, civilization of Kush. So the Nubian or Kush region was located south of Egypt along the Nile River. Kingdom of Kerma and Kush would often trade with Egypt. Thutmose III invaded and conquered Nubia. In 850 BCE, as Egypt declined, Nubians saw an opportunity to break away and create the kingdom of Kush and a new city called Napata. And over you see to your left, this picture here, these are like little mini pyramids. The Nubians kept the traditions, despite being thrown out of Egypt. They still kept the Egyptian traditions alive by building these mini pyramids. Kush traded with Egypt and soon became rich and strong enough to take over Egypt. Kushite king Kashta started the dynasty that ruled both Egypt and Kush. Like the Egyptians, Kushites built small pyramids to bury their kings. The Kushites eventually fell to the Assyrians but learned about iron weapons from them. Kushites then built a new capital city in Meroe. There they became a large center for trade. The people of the Meroe region had dark skin and are probably the ancestors of the Nubians of today. The society was strictly stratified on the basis of wealth. The Meroe society actively participated in the ancient slave trade. Artisans were accomplished and innovative in pottery and other crafts. Succession of the kingship was through the maternal line. The ruler was chosen from members of the royal family, with the queen mother having a strong influence. Okay. Queen mothers also played an important function in the coronation ritual as well. In the 2nd century BCE, there was a series of Meroitic ruling queens. Okay. So the Kushite monarchy was somewhat of a matriarchy. Okay. Egyptian was the official language of Kush. There are various tributes to Pi, the king of Napata, reveal some of what is known about Kushite culture. Okay. Eventually, with the Kushite shift southward, there was a shift to the Meroitic language, of which little is known or comprehended. Kushites achieved distinction in many artistic areas, notably architecture, construction, pottery, and sculpture. The 25th dynasty, King Taharqa, built and refurbished numerous temples, some in Egypt, but most in Nubia. Okay. And what I want you to remember out of this section of the Nubians, okay, is that Kush was an important trading corridor for Central and Southern Africa to the outside world. Okay, the Nubians are the connection between Egypt and South Africa. Yeah. The extent to which Kush was an important transmitter of culture and technology to the rest of Africa is still open to conjecture, especially with respect to the Western African civilizations. Okay. So little is known about the disappearance of the Kush state in about 250 AD. The state may have broken up into 3 independent kingdoms, Abatia, Makuria, and Alwa, of which little is known. Here is a nice little image of how, these replicas, okay, the way the Nubians were trying to build, these mini pyramids, paying homage to their culture, despite eventually being, thrown out. Okay, they still maintained and preserved their culture. Here's a painting showing the Nubians bringing bags of gold and treasures to King Tutankhamun. And here are the remains of some of the Nubian pyramids. And that pretty much sums up chapter 2. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm also available through Zoom. I always post links on the announcements page. And that's pretty much it. If you have any other questions, make sure to email me. Take care and stay safe. Goodbye.